Good evening, everyone. We love seeing people's responses. I love the energy, and it's so great to see such diverse representation from around the globe. Welcome, one and all, to the DEIB panel, How to Operationalize DEIB in 2024. My name is Heather Gilley, and I'm proud to be Grammarly's Chief People Officer and your host today. We have an exciting panel and some timely topics to cover, but before we begin, I'd like to share some quick notes on how the webinar is going to run today. So first, because of the size of the webinar, all attendees are going to be automatically muted. Second, to enable closed captioning, simply click the CC button at the bottom of your webinar window as pictured here. Third, we want to hear from you throughout the session, so please leave comments in the Q&A widget at any time, and we'll get to as many topics as we can after the panel discussion. And lastly, don't worry about taking notes. Just sit back and enjoy the show. We're going to follow up tomorrow with a recording of the event, so you won't miss a thing. Okay, so as we get into our next slide, I'm joined today by three stellar HR leaders, each with a long range of experience in their field and a deep passion for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So let's turn the floor over to them to introduce themselves. Let's start with you, Susan.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for having me here today. My name is Susan Laws, and I am on the DEIB Plus Inclusive Learning and Enablement team at Indeed. At Indeed, as you may be aware, we help all people get jobs, and that is our primary mission. And on my team, we design and implement DEIB learning experiences along with training and job aids for Indeed employees, who we call Indeedians, across the business and in all regions of the world in order to increase DEIB competency and empower our people to have impact with job seekers and employers. Our vision for DEIB at Indeed is to close the opportunity gap by reducing bias and removing barriers for job seekers. And so we strive for DEIB to actually be embedded into our products, our platforms, as well as how we show up in our communities. And our learning strategy, which we'll talk about today, is one part of realizing and fulfilling that goal.
Awesome. Welcome. Analia, would you please introduce yourself next?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Analia. I use she, her pronouns. It's a pleasure to be here. I come from the Bay Area. I live in San Francisco. I see a number of folks also representing the Bay Area, and I love to see also this global group here. So hi, and thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to be here. I am a director on the learning team at Paradigm, and at Paradigm, our focus is to partner with organizations to become more diverse, equitable, and inclusive in their structures and people processes, as well as in individual behaviors that really carry change forward. And our mission is to really, advance that diversity, equity, and inclusion within organizations in order to create an inclusive and equitable world more broadly. And so today, I'm excited to talk about how learning, which is really my forte at Paradigm, as I mentioned, can really shepherd DEIB change.
Welcome. And last but certainly not least, Maurice.
Hi, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Maurice Tuyasasopo-Bell. I lead DEIB and people analytics at Lattice. Lattice is a people platform that business leaders, HR teams rely on to create great managers and high-performing teams. Our focus on DEIB in particular is really trying to integrate DEIB in everything we do. It's a little bit of it's a journey. It's aspirational and very tangible based on the things that we've been building. I'm so excited to share more about it.
Well, we are so excited to hear from you. We recognize that you are a powerhouse crew, and we really appreciate the introductions. I actually feel very confident in speaking on behalf of our audience that we're really looking forward to hearing your perspectives today. So before we dive in, I want to provide some groundings on why the topic of DEIB is so important today. It's no surprise on the first statistic, 83% of companies have DEI initiatives underway. And while that's an impressive number compared to where we were with US employers in 2019, there is a part two. Part two is that there's also been reporting that C-suite endorsement of these initiatives is declining. And worse, only a fraction of employees, look at the stats, are finding that these initiatives are impactful or effective. So let's get into the discussion. And I always like to start with a poignant question, which is, what's the problem that we're solving? And as you can see by the statistics in the previous slide, there are strategies at play, but without proper programs for execution, company efforts are falling flat. So how do we fix this? Well, luckily for you, we have 3 experts here today to share what's working so that we can learn how we can turn that strategy into robust programs that drive real results. So let's learn from these experts. And for those of you who love a roadmap, we're going to cover 3 chapters in our discussion today. Chapter 1 is going to be around setting the strategy itself. Chapter 2 is going to be around measuring impact. And chapter 3 is going to be about bringing programs to life. All right, enough grounding. Let's get into the meat of it. To kick things off, we'd love to hear a bit about your 2023 DEIB strategies and what you're doing differently in 2024 and why. But here's my challenge to you. You're going to need to tell your story in about 3 minutes or less. So it's time to bring your TED Talk skills out. So Analia, why don't you go first this time?
Yeah, I'd love to. I'll start by naming that 2023 was a challenging year for DEI, to say the least. After unprecedented DEI commitment and investment in 2020, we did start to see a momentum shift last year, in part due to economic downturns, in part due to political headwinds. And last year at Paradigm, we partnered with over 500 companies alone, and most of them asked us, what are other companies doing to address DEI successfully? And they might try those things and they can work. But the pitfall is that it doesn't always stick, because it might not be what's right for them. So instead, we tell them, focus on the data. Measure how are people experiencing the workplace, and importantly, how did those experiences look different across different demographic groups in your workplace? And like with any DEI or any strategy or any change effort, period, any new program you want to implement, starting with the data really helps you rigorously prioritize what you want to focus on and put forth efforts that will give you the biggest impact in those focus areas. And then once you've prioritized your efforts on the learning side, make sure that people are aware of your priorities and why those are priorities, and give them opportunities to develop new behaviors that can help move those priority areas forward and have an impact in a widespread way. So, for example, if adding structure to your performance evaluations to mitigate bias is a priority, pair that with learning efforts that can bring people along in that change and equip them with skills, to use any new tools and give helpful feedback that mitigates the impact of bias. And then finally, for companies who did make commitments in 2020 and beyond, the question to be asking in 2024 is, are we doing the right things? And is what we are doing working? And employees are asking this as a way to hold their companies accountable. Executives are asking this as a way to measure ROI. So all that to say, don't let the economic downturns and political headwinds stall your efforts. Lean into the data, both to determine what to prioritize and to measure whether what you're doing is working, and bring employees along in the journey through ongoing targeted communication and learning efforts.
Wow, that answer was so solid. I love the examples of prioritization, the examples of how to operationalize, and the revisiting and the pivoting over time. Awesome. Maurice, can I transition it over to you?
Yeah. So I think we actually bucked the trend a little bit. So we started our DEIB journey in 2023, really at the top of the year, where we formalized the function and my team, the IDEA team, which is bringing together DEIB and people analytics. And so that we kicked off our year like saying, okay, hey, we're going to do this. This is important to us. And as a result of that, for me at least, I think we had a lot of meaningful conversations at the leadership levels where we wanted to make sure that we were being authentic in our work and our focus. And so a lot of the initial work in 2023 was really grounding ourselves and creating some collective consciousness around why is DEIB important to us, like us, Lattice, our leadership team. And so I actually kind of kicked off the year just doing a listening tour. I talked with every DE director and above in the organization, and I just asked them some simple questions like, what do you really think is the value of DEIB work? What do you think gets in the way of that work? What do our managers need to be better advocates and sponsors of the work? And what are some of your awareness gaps? What do you don't know? What was really powerful in that conversation for us was identifying that I think for some organizations, and rightly so, the conversation around DEIB is really centered on this idea of a moral imperative, right? We have the historical marginalization and challenges of different groups, underrepresented groups, and otherwise. And while that was valued and that was clearly identified as a theme, the thing that really stood out for us at Lattice, particularly because of what we do and the product that we're building, it was about maximizing talent. How we are bringing in people that we want to have be their full selves so they can do their best work. And so how are we creating an environment and thinking about the things that we do from an employee experience standpoint that is truly kind of bringing that full talent to life? And so that's kind of what was the work over the year, was really looking across our people programs and our employee experience to understand, one, start measuring it, and then two, start putting in kind of infrastructural components. So like we revisited all of our competencies for our roles and identified, is there particular things we're calling out around creating an inclusive environment or building diverse teams? We created our first manager onboarding program, and we had an inclusive leadership session that really centered on the idea of understanding, recognizing biases and addressing acts of exclusion. And we also looked at our performance processes, performance reviews, talent reviews, and are we actually standing up diverse perspectives and diverse work styles as something that is valued and as a part of the conversation. So a lot of the work that we did in 2023, really just kind of finding all those touch points across the employee journey, where we can kind of raise the lens of DEIB. Now, when we're talking about 2024, with the infrastructures in place, really what we're focusing on is role modeling, recognizing the leaders that are leaning into that and doing it right. So we give some recognition and also some visibility around what good looks like. And then we're also looking at continuing to close kind of the experience gap around not only folks from different backgrounds or diverse characteristics, but also we have a lot of folks that just have not had a lot of exposure to different diverse cultures and different diverse communities. And so creating opportunities for them to get more exposure, get more experience in a way that feels safe, and they can coming from a learning mindset.
Wow, congratulations. That's quite an accomplishment. I mean, to start with the raw data from your stakeholder interviews and then to develop all those programs, what a fantastic journey. Thank you. Susan, I'd love to hear from you.
Sure, thank you. So at Indeed, we identified an issue where all of our orgs had different proficiency levels when it came to DEIB competency. And we saw that some of the discrepancies were due to lack of engagement. And in other instances, it was simply the nature of the org and maybe their bandwidth to take on DEIB learning. Fortunately, our senior leadership at Indeed and our CEO are completely committed to DEIB as a company, and we won't rest on what's already been done or settle for the status quo. As Maurice just said, now it's a moral imperative. So in 2023, we worked to create a strategy that would allow Indeed to standardize its company-wide DEIB proficiency. To work toward using that strategy, we designed a new DEIB learning ecosystem founded on 3 capabilities and capacities that we want all Indeedians to have that I can talk about a little bit more about later. And in 2024, we're now in the implementation stage where we're working with leadership teams that oversee each org in order to customize learning journeys for their members, whether that's in marketing or customer success or sales, in order to achieve that new standard. And our DEIB business partners are also aligned with each facet of the business for consultancy, for recommendations, for learning support, and sometimes even identifying programs for their teams. So these kinds of partnerships and learning modalities are things that we have at our disposal to ensure that DEIB is embedded into every part of the business and is truly becoming the language, the common language that we all speak.
I love it. I'm definitely excited to hear more about the ecosystem. It's super exciting. Congratulations. Okay, so let's transition to chapter 2, which is measuring impact. This year wasn't just about establishing new strategies that you mentioned. It's also about providing evidence that we're making material differences. I'd say that so many themes in HR and people functions require data and statistics. And in today's market, it's really just a baseline requirement for how we demonstrate value. So part of the problem that we're facing is what I would call a perception problem. So let's dive into how we'll define and measure success this year. Again, we're looking for answers around 3 to 4 minutes to allow for Q&A at the end. So Analia, let's start with you. How are you using data and statistics to demonstrate impact and change?
Yeah. This is, I think, unsurprisingly, how companies can really set themselves apart with their DEI efforts. And at Paradigm, we measure impact as efficacy plus reach. So what I mean by that is efficacy is essentially how successful are we, or how effective are the efforts that we're implementing, and how many people are affected by or engaged in those efforts, or put more simply, how are we moving the needle and for how many people? So on the learning side, that might look like, measuring changes in people's understanding and behaviors around DEI. And we measure that in the surveys of folks that we train. So for example, we asked, to what extent do you understand strategies that you can use to create a more inclusive culture, or to manage bias or build ally skills, what have you? And of course, learning is only one part of the effort. So our strategy team also does a lot of work around measuring the maturity of DEI programs and the effectiveness of those programs, as well as using analytics to show how DEI actually drives change in representation, inclusion, and in anything else that you're trying to accomplish with an organization.
That's awesome. I love the equation that you put out for us, because so many times we're all struggling, like, what are the actual metrics that people are using across the board? So thanks for that insight. Susan, in your last answer, you articulated that your company has an acute focus on learning as part of your culture. What we'd love to understand is how DEIB shows up in the learning ecosystem that you launched, and if you could provide any other details there.
Sure. So when we introduced our learning ecosystem to the business at the end of 2023, we framed the DEIB business standard as a combination of capabilities. And those were raising the level of curiosity, which is actively pursuing empathy and understanding, establishing commitment, which is long-term sustained action toward DEIB, and then demonstrating courage, which is the support of others through vulnerability and allyship. And, we made the 3 capabilities into 3 C's to make them more memorable, because we really want Indeedians to integrate these actions into the employee experience. And, we're always saying we're looking for progress and not perfection. So when you consider something like DI maturity in those terms, it's important not to dismiss also incremental change. So taking these achievement levels into consideration, our measurement strategy falls into 4 categories of behavior that we can observe across the business, as well as things we can quantify. And some of those things are e-learning course completion, the data around completion, quarterly engagement surveys like pulse checks. And we're paying attention to how Indeedians are feeling on their team, with their job tasks, under their leadership, and in their org. We're also tracking membership in employee resource groups, what we call inclusion business resource groups, IBRGs. And then we can also observe attrition rates by demographic. And we think these data points can help us understand how DEIB is impacting Indeed employees in their daily work. We also want to be able to answer the questions: are Indeedians staying and thriving because they feel included, or are they leaving because they don't? Can all Indeed employees bring their whole selves to work, or do they feel like they can't? Are they empowered to impact the marketplace and our clients through the use of inclusive language, or are mistakes being made and sensibilities being offended? Is miscommunication being ignored, or is it being remedied?
It's awesome. Your 3 C's concept is definitely sticky, and I love the examples that you gave us around the metrics that you track and follow. Maurice, love to transition to you. So if you're comfortable with it, let's circle back to the impact question. And I'm sure we all define this differently, but I'd love to hear what you think about KPIs and maybe what 1 or 2 measurements or metrics that you publish within the company, and what do you measure regularly?
Yeah. So, I think I mentioned previously, but we're really focused on understanding and monitoring the experience gap. And when I'm saying experience gap is we're actually looking at all of our talent lifecycle data, or like when you think about the employee journey, hiring, performance, engagement, growth, transition. And we're looking at all of that together and then identifying, all right, at least are folks having a consistent experience or not, right? When we look at BIPOC versus white, or if we're looking at female versus male, age, any diversity characteristic, we're thinking about, hey, and it's all relative. We might just not be good at a certain area. And if we're not good at this, then we want that experience to be not good for everyone. Or if we're amazing at a certain aspect of our employee journey and within the company, we want it to be amazing for everyone. So we really think about it from like, how are we making sure that we're monitoring the gaps that might exist through demographic views. And then the work is really focused on how we're trying to close those gaps. In practice, we look at our hiring metrics and new hire metrics, of course, from a representation standpoint. We also look at pipeline in particular. Again, we feel strongly we want to make sure that we have a healthy, robust, diverse talent pipeline. We're going to ultimately hire the best talent through that process, and we've done some analysis to make sure that biases isn't affecting our hiring process, and the pass-through rates feel appropriate and relative. And so we've seen that work. And we focus on that. We pay attention to that pipeline representation. Performance, we're looking at performance ratings relative, slicing that by demographics, engagement data. We actually, this last year, part of one of our kind of the infrastructural pieces is we introduced a belonging question set within our engagement survey and as well as our pulse survey, which includes a question around feeling like everyone has a fair opportunity to succeed, of people's ability to make meaningful connections, and then senior leadership's commitment to building diverse teams. And so now we're starting to collect that data and monitor it through our pulse results, and then also looking at promotion rates and things like that. I will say, in terms of measuring impact, and what I think is really important is it's such a weird space right now with the DEIB work and people challenging ideas of whether it's valuable or not. It was really important for us internally. I knew, because we were starting from scratch, so to speak, or a lot of the work previously was more organic. I focused and leaned into one business line and built a relationship, particularly with one business line leadership group who were deeply interested in saying, hey, we want to lean into this DEIB work. I said, great. And we sat down, we worked together, we built out an action plan, and then we just followed through and managed that plan throughout the year. I think communication, so people see that there's work that's happening, is really important too. So I didn't go for trying to create enterprise change. I wanted to find and identify a particular business line that had the leadership that was interested and engaged in the process. And then lo and behold, at the end of the year, really across all of our talent lifecycle data, we saw meaningful improvement in a way that we weren't seeing similarly in other groups. And so I'm excited now for 2024 because now I have something to point to. I can say, measuring impact, look at this group. The proof's in the pudding. And it's really exciting. It's actually building some really good energy in the organization.
Oh my gosh. I mean, definitely the Lattice business model is all around measurement. So it's no surprise that you are quite sophisticated in looking at everything across the spectrum, but I'm definitely inspired by your business line pilot and capturing and capitalizing on that energy. That's awesome. Okay, so if the group's okay with it, we're going to transition to our 3rd chapter, which is about bringing programs to life. So successful DEIB strategies do a few things. First, they map back to company priorities and initiatives. Second, they clearly define what success looks like. And third, they provide opportunities for people at all levels to drive change. But for these programs to be successful, DEIB has to be woven into the ways we work, where we work, and especially the tools that we work with. So, Maurice, I'm going to actually kick it back over to you. I know that you lead a people analytics team, and we'd love to know how you use data to understand your employees and how you bring programs to life.
Yeah, so one of the things that was really important as we were building the DEIB function, we were also building this people analytics function. And I'm actually brought in a really powerful data scientist and organizational psychologist who was amazing on my team, Colby Nesbitt. She's awesome. One of the things that was really important for me is as we were talking about really trying to wrap people's heads and minds around the work of DEIB from a qualitative standpoint, quantitatively, we had to get our data in order and organized. And we had not really had prior to this last year, kind of the one source of truth. And essentially what we've built is what we call a QPR. It's a quarterly people report that really brings together all of our data, and it's really looking at the full talent life cycle. And I just think it's important that you have all of that in one place because it tells more of a holistic story when you see patterns really across the employee journey, as opposed to which we also do. We'll do like end of cycle, performance cycle. We'll do a performance cycle review and say, okay, what was the impact of the cycle? A lot of that is more about performance things around participation or completion of process type stuff. But then when we come to the quarter, we're actually looking at the whole scale. We're cutting across our demographic data, which we have access to, which primarily is ethnicity, gender. We'll look at location, seniority. We look at job functions, right? Because work might show up differently in different groups. So we're looking at really as many segments of the organization that we can compare. And again, we're looking at gaps, like are people having a consistent experience or not? And if they're not, is there a why behind that? And if there's not a why behind that, that's where we really need to start. We need to start teasing.
Oh, that's great. Congratulations. I mean, aggregating multiple data points into one ecosystem is quite a feat. And for you to be able to identify patterns and gaps is even better. So congratulations.
And I would also say too, as much as it's about like having the tools, which we've kind of built this reporting mechanism, dashboards and things like that to do, you also have to meet the business where they're at. And so when you start talking about data, people are going to have different comfort, different relationships with data. And so I think it's also important that you're mindful of that and you're doing the work of translating. What does this mean to me? Why is this important to me? What does it mean within the context of my organization or my department? And that work, I think, is actually more powerful than having some like really sophisticated data analysis, because sometimes it's just not accessible. People are like, I don't know what that number means. I don't know how to relate to that number.
So does part of that involve you coming in with like a template and a starting point and then really kind of calibrating with your business to understand their efforts, their interest, and what data to explore?
I think one of the things that's been amazing at Lattice, and I know this might be unique for us, is like it's just a lot of trust in terms of like what we're bringing to the table. So I haven't experienced myself a lot of resistance around, I don't trust that data, or I don't think that's accurate. It's more like, I don't know how to, if we said we had 20% of our BIPOC community was underperforming, right? Okay, is that good? Is that bad? How should I understand that? How should I relate that? And so what I have found to be important is bringing it back into context of like the real lived experience, right? At the end of the day, when we're looking at people data, there's people working and living a life like behind all of that data. And so, you might say 20%, but okay, if you have 10 BIPOC identifying employees, or I'm sorry, 10 employees on your team, that's two out of that 10. Now it's like it's a little more tangible for folks. And so I just think it's important as you're thinking about data, as you're measuring impact and creating reporting, which I think is really a powerful tool, sources of truth, things that you can stand up and say, this is the reality of things. You also are doing the storytelling and making it make sense from like a real lived experience.
Great. Thank you. Analia, I'm going to transition over to you. You are in a very unique position where you work with so many different businesses to help design sustainable DEIB training plans. Sure, you've seen complex, but for this call, could we hone in on some low-hanging fruit ideas for us to consider?
Absolutely. Interestingly, I heard Maurice speak to one example of low-hanging fruit that I have seen be effective with many companies that we work with, and that is identifying who your change champions are. Who are your DEIB champions? And so, Maurice, I heard you mention that example of the business line that was eager and engaged early on, and it sounded like they reached out proactively to you. That may or may not be the case at at anyone's company, anyone who's here today. But if you have a sense of who are the folks who you can activate to be your DEIB champions, that's a great place to start with DEIB change or any change effort. And that's especially important as as you look to more senior levels of leadership. So figuring out who are your senior leaders, your executive leaders that you can really activate early. And if you don't know, ask. We work with a global company who did this recently with their training efforts, and they put out a call to see who was interested in piloting their DEIB learning journey, and they got some pretty significant interest. And so among those folks who opted in, they piloted that learning journey. They piloted not only the training, but also, various forms of communication and engagement tactics. And they saw a really great response. And so for the things that worked, then they scaled those efforts to the broader organization. The things that were less effective, they maybe didn't continue those efforts more broadly. And they had that active audience of DEIB champions, not only to test this out with, but also to give them feedback on those things that were working. So I would say start there, figure out who are your DEIB champions, especially at those senior levels of leadership and in various lines of business and so forth. And then think about how you can cascade or scale the things that are working with that captive audience to the broader organization.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you. I love just the hooking in on energy with the people who have passion and energy. It's definitely such a great technique. Susan, I love how you've been talking about employee empowerment. Can you talk about how you empower your employees to make the most of and also learn the most from your DEIB programs?
Sure. So I can give you one example. In 2022, Indeed launched our inclusive language guide as an internal resource to employees. And we saw that Indeedians were engaging their curiosity about inclusive language by seeking out the language guide on their own and using it as a reference tool, like a glossary of inclusive words and phrases. So maybe when, terms or words would come up in business interactions, or when they wanted to make sure they were using inclusive language themselves. The nature of the resource being an external or being a separate guide made it something that was useful to consult after the fact, like maybe after being on a call and saying something like, I'm such a sports junkie, which is kind of a derogatory word that can be insensitive to people who have experienced addiction, for example. But there should also be an opportunity to be more proactive with inclusive language and not just reactive. So that's the commitment piece, the sustained action. And then even the tool really was an example of learning in the flow of work as a resource. We still had no way of capturing the data around actual learning behavior. We had no analytics that could tell a story about how the business was changing. And we got a lot of suggestions and a lot of feedback from Indeed employees across the world. We had a colleague in an office in Italy come to us and say, we really need this guide in Italian. So we localized the resource in Italian. But the language guide was still a disconnected resource that you had to seek out on your own. And then you could only do that if you knew about it. But then when we integrated our language glossary with Grammarly to create an inclusive language style guide, we were really putting the tool in the hands of our employees, like quite literally at their fingertips, and making the learning experience frictionless. So now we can measure learning and behavior change by capturing the analytics for what words and phrases are being used and how often, how many users are changing non-inclusive language like stakeholder to better inclusive options like interested parties or partners, and then the percentage of adoption of these better and more inclusive suggestions. So by moving away from a conventionally recognized term, that's really hard to do. Do we have the courage to do that? The results that we've seen suggest to us that operationalizing our inclusive language guide is empowering employees to have new and better conversations with each other, with clients, and with the marketplace. And again, making that learning frictionless, I think, is what really put us on the path of realizing that learning goal.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. And I could definitely see your 3 C's coming to life throughout all that too. Awesome. All right, so I'm going to end this section with one last quick fire question, okay? So the question is, what tools enable you to operationalize your work and drive the most impact? And if you're okay with it, I'd love to advocate for all of you as well. So I'm going to jump in here. So we actually use all of your company tools, including our own. Here at Grammarly, we use Lattice for our one-on-ones and reviews. We love it. Paradigm for our training, and we love it. And we post open roles on Indeed to help us source a diverse range of qualified candidates, and we love it. What you should know is everyone at Grammarly actually writes with Grammarly. And Susan, you talked a lot about style guides, and our style guide feature can definitely be customized based on preference, change, technique, right? Like what you're trying to drive in terms of culture across your company. But what we love about it is it helps encourage inclusive language as we write. We also have circle groups, which is our version of ERG programs that drive connection and belonging amongst what we call our grammarians. So Maurice, I'd love to kick it over to you.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the work that we did last year around all this kind of infrastructure work, like it goes unseen. But what we actually built was internally was just a DEIB playbook. And I think for me, I hesitated initially on like, I was like, playbook that feels cheesy or like everyone's doing a playbook. What I found and what I learned as we were doing all this work kind of behind the scenes is no one knew about it. And a lot of times, I think I was initially spending time trying to get people's minds like or focused on awareness or like engagement and commitment. And I think a lot of folks were like, "Hey, just like I don't know how to do these things. It's foreign to me, right? I don't have the lived experience, and I'm not sure how to do it." And so we actually built a playbook that, first and foremost, oriented DEIB to our mission and our values. Like, why is this important to us? And some of that initial framing, first principles work that I talked about. Then we also in this playbook include our data. And we're trying to be as transparent as possible around our progress, and we update it quarterly along with the quarterly people report I mentioned. And then we have a section that really goes across the employee lifecycle, talks about what we're doing from like a company function standpoint, what managers can be doing. And there's like a challenge question that kind of like, hey, challenge your thinking around this. And then there's a section that's really kind of just practical habits and behaviors of things that you kind of do maybe on the day to day or week to week. And we have that spread across hiring, performance, engagement, and growth. And so that to me has been a really important tool. We've also framed a lot of that behavior to align with our people programs, our processes, the use of Lattice and other things that we have. So it's not like we're trying to ask people to do this other thing. We're saying, hey, when you're doing the work that you do on the day-to-day basis, on a week-to-week basis, just put this lens on or consider it this way or try this different approach or different behavior. And that's been really helpful.
Great. Analia, what about Lattice?
Yeah. Oh, well, Maurice spoke for
Oh,
Lattice. I'll speak
I
for
said,
Paradigm.
I'm so sorry.
No,
Paradigm?
don't be. That's all right. We use Lattice as well. So I heard Susan say earlier the word frictionless. And I think I want to underscore that when I'm speaking about tools that can be really helpful to operationalize DEIB, not only for deploying scalable learning journeys, but also just for helping individuals adopt new inclusive behaviors. And I spoke earlier about the DEIB champions, right? Activating that captive audience within your organization. And I think one example of some frictionless tools you can provide to a group like DEIB champions are maybe communication templates, things that they can use to share with the rest of the organization. Here's a training that I did, here's what I learned, and here are some new behaviors, even if it's just one new behavior that I'm committing to moving forward. That can go a long way toward helping those champions or anyone else at your organization be able to communicate clearly and in line with the priorities that you've created as a company in a frictionless way. So I love that language, Susan. So I'm going to borrow that language, and then I'll also just double click on what Maurice said about a playbook. Right, there are so many different forms of playbooks, and we partner with countless organizations on helping them create those playbooks. If you don't have the infrastructure internally, like it sounds like Lattice does, to create that playbook for your organization, that's something that we partner with a number of organizations to create in line, again, with their DEIB priorities.
Absolutely. And Susan, what say you about the topic?
So the style guide that I mentioned earlier is meant, to be an instructional tool and not a prescriptive mandate. So the fear might be that we're policing language, but that's not at all what it's meant to do. The impact is really the frequency of conversations that are now being had around our intentional use of language. And I saw someone ask a question about pushback. I wouldn't call it pushback necessarily, but really people are trying to understand why this tool is being put in people's hands. And it's really to allow us to have our best conversations and to make us, when we interact with clients in the marketplace, to give us the power, to use the best language.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So first of all, we're gonna transition into our discussion summary. But I want to start by just saying, so many times as HR leaders, we're in the seat where we're trying to track down best practices in the marketplace. And sometimes we go to webs, and sometimes we go to networks, and sometimes we go to our HR groups and memberships. But I think that our audience would absolutely underscore that what was most impactful about your stories was that you gave us real examples and guidance for implementing. And so for that, we're extremely grateful. And we thank you for your passion and your focus on such an important topic. I do want to just do a little bit of a commentary here, which is, before we open it up to Q&A, I just want to mention that anyone on the call is going to be able to get in touch with every company on the panel, because there's so much data to share and leverage after the webinar. And hopefully you can leverage that opportunity to better understand how you can use their products to operationalize your DEIB programs. You'll also notice that there was a poll pop up on screen. So we'd love for you to fill this out if you'd like to talk to one of the Grammarly product experts to see a demo and to learn more about how you can bring inclusive language into everyday lives of your employees, just like you heard Susan share with Indeed's programs. We'll also send out direct links to connect you with each of the experts from Indeed, Lattice, and Paradigm. So just stay tuned and check your inboxes. Okay, so now's the fun part. We're going to open it up to Q&A, and I just want to say thank you for keeping your answers succinct, because now we've got some really good time to spend here. Okay, so thank you as audience members for submitting the questions. So we're going to try to get to as many as possible, and we've bucketed in themes. So the first one is, could each of you expand on what you include in your playbook that you reference? Perhaps someone could give one key piece of a playbook, and you could each add on to that. And Maurice, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, I think I mentioned some of the things, the pieces that we have in there. I do think it's really important. I'll just double down on why is DEI, why are we focused on DEIB? I think that gets to the piece around perception challenges, is like just really being succinct. Why us, our organization, our mission, our values, what makes us who we are, the components of our DNA. Why are we focused on DEIB, and being really clear on that? And I think that's important to have in the playbook. The other thing that I added here that I didn't speak to was also, I have a section around our journey, just to give context to, like, we are right at the start of our journey. And I think if folks are kind of engaging in the broader conversations around DEIB, people are at different places in their organization. We actually use a framework called the five stages of DEI, which was it's an HBR article. But we use that to say, hey, it's very clear once we look at these different stages, we were like in this tactical place, and like we're right on the precipice of kind of getting into this integrated spot. And I think a lot of times people get caught up in conversations that are like, no, that's more maybe in like the sustainable place, right? Or other folks are like, no, we're in compliance. Like we're at step one. So I just think that having context around your journey and where you are also kind of helps people just have more appreciation for the work that's ahead and why we're focused on the things we're focused on right now versus other things that we might not be focused on.
Absolutely. So let's keep adding to the answer. Analia, you're the next box over.
Yeah, I want to just stress the importance of not only meeting the organization where they're at, but also meeting key audiences where they're at. So I think that the key to an effective playbook is first and foremost knowing who it is meant for. And I'll give some examples of that. We've partnered with organizations who want a playbook for their managers to, really own inclusive leadership behaviors and skills. And so that might look like incorporating some of those DEIB competencies in a paradigm that we do that in terms of a framework of inclusive behaviors that include managing unconscious bias, creating an environment of belonging, an environment of voice and psychological safety. And the last part of the framework is growth, right? An environment where people really feel like they have the opportunity to grow and that their managers, their leaders believe they can grow. And so a playbook for managers in line with that framework might really home in on the behaviors that those managers are expected or encouraged to demonstrate in the workplace. Some other examples of audiences for a playbook might be HR business partners, right? How do we put on our DEIB lenses when we are, working with employees on some sensitive topics, right? Managing employee relations matters, for example. It really starts with knowing who is your audience and to Maurice's point, really understanding where they're at and what are the behaviors you want to see them using in their work.
Excellent. And then Susan, what components would you add to that?
Sure. So at Indeed, we want to impact hiring. We want to make hiring more equitable, removing barriers and biases and obstacles to hiring. So I mentioned earlier that DEIB competency in our own employees affects how we show up in our own communities, and that is the impact. Internally to Indeed, our learning ecosystem is like a playbook in that it's a journey to competence. It's a roadmap to competency, and there's levels to it, and it's ongoing.
Awesome. Susan, I'm going to stay with you. You mentioned DEIB competencies, and so the teams would love to hear a little bit more about examples of what you mean by that.
Sure. So DEIB competencies would be understanding empathy, understanding implicit bias, understanding psychological safety at work, and understanding how marginalized communities are impacted, in our context, are impacted in terms of hiring, in terms of obstacles and barriers. So the understanding of those things, but then also being able to action alternatives and action, the ways that we want to avoid those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. Great. Maurice, okay, I'm going to kick out another topic. So, we talked a lot about capitalizing on people who are advocates in DEIB space, but I think that the question that's coming in from the audience is, How should we be thinking about addressing employees who voice that perhaps DEIB is a wasted effort or isn't yielding results? And in the spirit of that, if you think about how do you emphasize that DEIB is integral to all areas of the company rather than just probably an extra thing to do?
Yeah, I think that has been a fun part of this whole thing it's been fun to navigate because um I like I mentioned, I had conversations with all directors and above and had varying exposure and acumen around DEIB work. And one, I think it's important if you are a practitioner, um, and I think it was called out before, meeting folks where they're at. Like, there was definitely some conversations where I had to check myself because I was like, I don't like the way you said that, or I think you're missing the point here. But you really got to do the perspective taking, right? And a little bit of that's role modeling too. It's like, where is this person coming from? What's their context, right? What's making them tick? And so I think one that part is important, right? We will hear people, minds are private. I don't know what that person's life experience is. I want to receive what they're saying from where it's intended or where it's coming from, not necessarily react based on my own personal experiences or perspective. So that I think is just important in terms of like calling people in versus calling people out. That's how you build coalition. That's how you build partnership. So I think that's important. The other piece is um, I think we other DEIB, like we talk about it like it's this other thing, right? And then we can objectify it, right? And have that type of critical conversation around it. It exists. It's here. Like your people are diverse. Your people exist. It's the work that you're doing on a day-to-day basis. Whether, if you want to call it DEIB, all I'm asking, at least I ask my organization, is I'm asking for you to kind of put on a lens. I'm not asking you to do anything different. I think if you're able to put on that DEIB lens, do some more perspective taking, appreciate, it's like that the platinum rule, right? Of like treat people the way they want to be treated, right? And if you can understand where people are at and what their needs are, and like I had mentioned, the authentic component for Lattice was it's all in the spirit of maximizing talent, right? You've got this talent here on your team or in your organization, but you're not getting the full ROI because they don't feel like they can fully belong, right? So how do we do that to then get maximize that, get the best work and the best outputs from them? That, for me at least, has been really helpful in speaking like business leader, language, right? Like talking to ROI, talking about yielding the best from the things that we've made investments in.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's a great answer. Susan, so many of our work environments are either hybrid or remote work. And so the teams are asking, do you have any initiatives or success stories that you've seen work in these types of environments across either geographies or different cultures?
So, in a previous conversation, Analia had mentioned something about the power of hybrid learning and blended learning. And so something that we have operationalized is creating self-paced learning and e-learning experiences for managers, and then having those managers attend synchronous or live training to kind of break down the theory into practice so that they can then take those initiatives to their teams and kind of spread, trickle down that learning and those actions. And that's just, one example that we can think of our reach of reaching all Indeedians across the globe.
So, Annalie, I'm going to come over to you. How are you encouraging and influencing your employees to implement accessibility across your organization? Do you have any specific assistive technology, either hardware or services, that are available to any or all employees to utilize?
Yeah, I love this question, and I appreciate that somebody asked it. And we're seeing more and more companies add accessibility as part of their acronym. IDEA, for example, IDEA, the A standing for accessibility, is something we're seeing more and more with companies we partner with. And I will say this is something that we are always striving to be better at ourselves at Paradigm. And so like with other DEIB and accessibility initiatives, with any initiative, it's about understanding the data and what needs maybe exist across the organization. Now, there are some pitfalls to that because when it comes to accessibility and disability, you're not always going to know what people's needs are if they haven't disclosed a disability or an accessibility need, right? So I think, to your specific question about hardware or technology, I'll be transparent in saying that is not something that we directly support companies with at Paradigm, but we are constantly thinking about it in, DEIB and accessibility efforts with respect to strategy and learning and implementing more and more accessibility improvements in our e-learning software, for example, Reach. And so it's an area where, like with all DEIB initiatives and accessibility, now I'll add the A to it. It's really about not being perfect. I think this was said earlier, right? Not being perfect, but making progress and constantly evaluating what are the things that we're doing well, where do the gaps remain, and how can we start to close those gaps?
Excellent. Well, I know that we are about a minute out, and so I just again want to end by saying thank you. We are very grateful for your time, for your energy, for your examples. We'd love to bring everyone back together, and I'd love to kick it off with a question around economic challenges and political headwinds facing us in the next few years. I think that would be an awesome baseline question. But to the audience, thank you so much for attending, and a massive thank you to Susan, Analia, and Maurice for sharing your stories and thoughts. Again, everyone's going to get information on every company that you heard about today, as well as a recording of the webinar in your inbox. So a shout out to everyone. Follow us all on social media to stay in touch, and we'll see you at the next webinar.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.